The Arizona sun beat down on the porch as Evelyn Evie Hayes wrestled with a stubborn suitcase zipper. She was a planner, a doer, and a woman who made things happen. And right now, what was happening was the culmination of 2 years of meticulous planning, a luxurious, all-expenses-paid trip to Sedona for her parents. She'd envisioned it all: breathtaking red rock vistas, comfortable accommodations, guided tours, and exquisite meals. She'd been working extra shifts at the local library to save the funds and had even carefully curated a collection of local artisan souvenirs. Her parents, Robert and Marlene, were creatures of habit, generally content with their quiet life in their small Arizona town. Evie's own life was in stark contrast: a carefully managed routine of work, occasional social gatherings with her friend Grace, and a deep sense of responsibility. Evie was always the one to make things happen. She was the one who anticipated needs and filled them. Her sister, Tiffany, however, well, Tiffany was a different story altogether. She was a whirlwind of drama and dependency, drifting through life with no discernible career and a constant need for attention. As Evie struggled with the stubborn zipper, a familiar car pulled up into the driveway. It was the shiny black vehicle of her younger sister, Tiffany. Tiffany was the kind of woman who could look immaculate even while doing absolutely nothing of consequence. She hopped out of her car with her usual careless charm, her designer sunglasses perched atop her head. "Hey, Evie. What's all the commotion?" She gestured towards the suitcase. "Getting ready for the Sedona trip." Evie responded shortly, attempting to hide her frustration with the zipper. Tiffany's eyebrows shot up. "Oh, right. That trip you've been going on about. Mom told me you booked some expensive hotel or something." She looked around the porch, as if searching for something she couldn't quite name. Just then, the front door swung open and Marlene emerged, her face a picture of carefully constructed cheerfulness. "Evie, dear, are you about ready? We're so excited." Robert followed closely behind, his expression a bit more reserved. Evie forced a smile. "Almost, Mom. Just need to get this zipper to cooperate." Marlene chuckled, a sound that always made Evie's stomach churn with unease. "Oh, you and your little struggles, Evie. Always working so hard." She turned to Tiffany, a twinkle in her eye. "Come on in, dear. Let's wait in the cool." Tiffany sauntered inside, leaving Evie to wrestle with the luggage. As Evie managed to yank the zipper shut, Marlene emerged from the house again. "Evie, dear, we have some news." Evie straightened up, bracing herself. Marlene's news was rarely good news for her. "Well," Marlene continued, her voice a little too casual. "We've decided that Tiffany should come to Sedona instead of you." Evie's jaw dropped. "What?" Marlene waved a hand dismissively, her face still held in that fake smile. "Oh, honey, don't look so surprised. Tiffany has been under a lot of stress lately, what with her, well, you know, all the things she's been going through, and she needs this trip more than you do." Robert looked down at his shoes, shuffling his feet. He was a good man, but rarely stood up to his wife's machinations. Evie's chest tightened, a sharp pain cutting through her. But I planned this. I've been working for 2 years for this. I paid for everything." Marlene brushed her words aside like so much lint. "Oh, don't be silly. You can take another trip later. You're always working so hard. Tiffany really needs a break. Think of it as a gift of kindness, dear. It's what family is for." Tiffany sauntered back out onto the porch, a smug look plastered on her face. "Thanks for understanding, sis," she said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "It's not like you're missing anything special, anyway. Just a bunch of rocks." Evie stared at them, her mind reeling. She couldn't believe this was happening. This was her trip, something she'd looked forward to for so long, a gift she was giving them, not something they had a right to take. But as she looked at their faces, a cold realization dawned on her. It didn't matter how hard she worked, or how much she sacrificed, in their eyes, she would always be second. "Okay," Evie said, her voice flat. "Fine. You want to take Tiffany?" Then take Tiffany. She forced a smile that felt like it was cracking her face. She grabbed their luggage and shoved it into the trunk of her car, her knuckles white around the handle. She was going to drive them to the airport, but she wasn't going to let them slide without facing some consequences. The drive to the airport was an exercise in forced civility. Marlene and Tiffany were chatting away about Sedona, excitedly discussing their shopping plans and spa appointments. Robert sat in the passenger seat, his silence heavy with discomfort. He didn't look Evie in the eyes even once. Tiffany leaned forward in the back seat, her voice laced with a condescending cheerfulness. "You're not mad, right, Evie? I mean, this is really big of you, letting me go. I could never have afforded this on my own." Evie clenched her jaw, forcing another fake smile. "Of course, Tiffany. Have a great time." At the airport drop-off, Marlene gave Evie a brief, perfunctory hug. "Thank you for understanding, sweetheart. This means so much to us, and to Tiffany." Tiffany followed with a smug wave. "Thanks, Evie, you're the best." Evie watched them disappear into the terminal, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and hurt. The ride back home was a blur. As soon as she walked through the door, she didn't hesitate. She grabbed her laptop and logged into every travel account she'd used to book the trip. Hotel reservations? Cancelled. Guided tours? Refunded. First-class airline upgrades? Gone. She cancelled them all without a second thought. Let them explain themselves to the front desk in Sedona. Let them experience the trip that she wasn't going to fund. She was done playing the role of the family doormat. A strange sense of satisfaction settled in her stomach. The phone started buzzing as soon as their flight landed. She ignored them. Evie was in the process of unpacking her suitcase, the one she had carefully packed for the trip that was no longer hers. As she placed her favorite pair of walking shoes back on the shelf, she continued to ignore her ringing phone. Finally, she decided to answer, if only to stop the barrage of calls. Marlene's voice was a tidal wave of anger the moment Evie picked up. "Evie. What did you do? The hotel says our reservation was cancelled. And there are no tours. What's going on?" Evie let her rant for a moment, then replied calmly. "I cancelled them." There was a stunned silence. You what? Why would you do that?" "Oh, I don't know, Mom. Maybe because you decided to take Tiffany on my trip?" Evie's voice was sharp with sarcasm. "You're lucky I even drove you to the airport. We thought you'd understand." Marlene hissed. "Understand what?" Evie's voice rose. "So, are you saying that all my years of saving and planning don't matter just because Tiffany needs a break? Do you think my effort means nothing? Well, guess what? I don't understand, and I really don't care." She hung up the phone, turning it off and tossing it on the couch. The next call came from Tiffany. She let it go to voicemail. "Evie, this is so petty." She snapped, her voice dripping with entitlement. "We're stuck here because of you. You need to call the hotel and fix this now." Evie rolled her eyes and deleted the message. For years, she'd been their fixer, the one who smoothed over every mistake and picked up every bit of slack. Not anymore. The calls and texts continued for the next 2 days. They grew increasingly frantic. They alternated between anger, pleading, and tearful accusations. She mostly ignored them. She took long walks in the desert, watched old movies, and caught up on her reading. She found that a sense of peace was slowly beginning to replace the feeling of anger and hurt. Finally, on the 3rd day, curiosity got the better of her. She turned her phone back on. The messages and voicemails were a storm of blame and outrage. "Evie, you've gone too far. Your sister is in tears, and your father is furious. We can't get into any of the hotels you booked. What kind of daughter are you? You're acting like a child. I don't get why you're making this such a big deal. Just fix it already. Evie, we need to talk. This isn't right." Evie shook her head, poured herself a cup of tea, and sat down at the kitchen table, letting the anger simmer. How dare they? How dare they act like she was the one in the wrong? The next call came moments later. It was Marlene. Evie, this isn't funny anymore. She barked. We're stranded. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? Evie took a slow sip of tea. Embarrassing? You think this is embarrassing? Try saving for years, planning every detail, and then being told you're not even part of the trip you paid for. Stop being dramatic. Marlene snapped. Tiffany needed this more than you. Well, now she can figure it out. Evie said firmly. You made your decision, Mom. You wanted to take Tiffany instead of me. Fine. But don't expect me to fund her vacation. We're family. Marlene hissed. We don't do this to each other. Evie let out a bitter laugh. Funny. I was just thinking the same thing. Tiffany's voice whined in the background. Mom, just hang up on her. She's being impossible. Enjoy your trip. Evie said, her tone icy. Oh, wait, you can't, because it's not your trip. It was mine, and now it's nobody's. Goodbye. She hung up and turned off the phone again. For the rest of the evening, she felt an odd mix of anger and relief. She wasn't going to let them take advantage of her anymore. She was done. The quiet lasted a couple of days, but by Monday morning, her phone was buzzing non-stop. This time, she answered. It was Robert, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Evie, he began. Your mother wanted me to call. She thinks you'll listen to me. Go on. Evie said, leaning back in her chair. He sighed. Look, this has all gotten out of hand. Your mother is upset, Tiffany's furious, it's just a mess. You're better than this, Evie. Evie stiffened. Better than what, Dad? Standing up for myself? Refusing to let you walk all over me again? That's not what I meant. It's just, you've always been the reasonable one. The one who keeps everything together. This isn't like you. Evie let out a short, bitter laugh. You're right. It's not like me, because I'm not bending over backward to clean up your mess. He paused, and for a moment Evie thought he might actually understand her point of view. You're punishing the whole family over one decision. Is that really fair? Fair? Evie's voice rose. You want to talk about fair? Was it fair when you and Mom decided that I wasn't important enough to be a part of the trip I planned? Was it fair when you replaced me with Tiffany, as if I didn't matter? That's not what we were trying to do. Robert said, sounding defensive. We just thought Tiffany needed it more. Of course you did. Evie snapped. You always think she needs more attention, more support, more of everything. And I'm always the one expected to sacrifice for her. Not anymore. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Finally, he said. I don't know what you want me to say. I don't need you to say anything. Evie replied, her voice steady. I just need you to understand that I'm done being an afterthought. From now on, I'm putting myself first. Goodbye, Dad. She hung up the phone, her hands trembling. She spent the rest of the day processing the anger, sadness, and even a small sense of relief. It wasn't easy, but it felt like a start. She was done with being the family fixer. A few days later, after what felt like a lifetime of quiet, Evie saw her parents' taxi pull into their driveway. She was ready. She sat on their porch, sipping a cup of coffee, feeling surprisingly calm. When they stepped out of the taxi, they looked pretty rough. Tired, disheveled, and visibly annoyed, Tiffany was the first to speak. Well, I hope you're happy, Evie. Evie raised an eyebrow, taking a sip of coffee. Happy about what? Our trip was a disaster. Marlene snapped, waving a hand as if to dismiss the entire experience. We spent the entire week staying in dingy motels and eating terrible food because we couldn't afford anything decent. And don't even get me started on the tours. Tiffany chimed in, crossing her arms. Oh, wait, there weren't any. Do you know how embarrassing it was to show up and be told there was no reservation? Evie took another sip of coffee. Sounds rough, she said calmly. But you wanted to take Tiffany, remember? I'm sure you all had some great bonding time. That's not the point. Marlene shot back, her voice rising. You knew we couldn't afford all the things you'd planned. You set us up to fail. Evie stood up, setting her mug down on the small table next to her. No, Mom, I didn't set you up for anything. I planned a trip for the three of us, something special. You're the ones who decided to cut me out at the last second. Robert finally spoke up, his tone quieter but no less accusatory. You didn't have to cancel everything, Evie. That was extreme. Was it? Evie asked, folding her arms. Why should I have paid for a trip I wasn't even invited to? If Tiffany needed it so badly, you should have planned it yourselves. You were lucky that I didn't cancel the return flight. Tiffany rolled her eyes. You're so dramatic. It's just money, Evie. And you're so entitled. Evie shot back, her patience finally snapping. Do you have any idea how much work and sacrifice went into planning that trip? Or do you just assume things magically appear for you, because someone else takes care of it? They stood there, stunned into silence for a moment. I've spent years being the responsible one. Evie continued, her voice steady but firm. The one who fixes things, plans things, makes sure everything runs smoothly. And you've spent just as long taking it all for granted. That's not fair. No, Mom, she continued before her mother could speak. What's not fair is how you treated me. You chose Tiffany over me, like always, so I chose to stop being your doormat. You didn't want me on the trip? Fine. But you don't get to enjoy the benefits of my hard work without me. Evie grabbed her bag from the porch swing and turned to leave. I'm glad you're back safely, but don't expect things to go back to the way they were. I'm done. She walked to her car, the echoes of their calls fading away. She needed to create her new normal. The drive home felt strangely peaceful. For years, every visit to her parents' house had left her emotionally drained, but not this time. She felt lighter, as if she'd shed a heavy weight. She'd spoken her truth, and she was not going to apologize for it. Grace showed up unannounced later that evening, armed with 2 bottles of craft sodas. I heard about it all from your mom. As usual, she left out all the things that led you to take back your trip. Grace said with a sly smile. Of course she did. Evie replied, laughing. How many times has she done that to me? So, what did you say? Grace grinned. I told her that you were probably busy and that you would get back to her when you were ready. You're the best. Evie said, shaking her head. No, you're the best. Grace replied, her tone turning serious. Because you finally stood up for yourself. I know how hard that is, Evie. Don't let them drag you back down. Her words stayed with Evie long after Grace left. She knew Grace was right. She'd spent too long bending over backward to please people who seemed to care little about her feelings. It was time to start focusing on her own well-being and her own dreams. Over the next few weeks, Evie found her footing. She spent her mornings sipping coffee on her back porch, enjoying the stillness of the desert. She spent her afternoons working at the library and her evenings pursuing creative endeavors, things she'd always wanted to do but never had time for. She had started journaling and had filled her notebook with new goals and aspirations. She had a new vision of who she was and who she wanted to be. She figured out there was more in life than just dealing with her family's issues. She found herself drawn to the idea of solo travel. It was time for her to have an adventure on her own terms. After weeks of contemplation, Evie booked a solo trip to Savannah, Georgia. The idea had taken hold when she was doing research for a library program and she'd become enamored with the history of the South. The moment she landed in Savannah, she felt a surge of both excitement and trepidation. As she stepped out of the airport and into the warm, humid air, she knew she'd made the right decision. She spent the next few days wandering through the historic streets, marveling at the architecture, and absorbing the city's rich and vibrant atmosphere. She strolled through moss-draped squares, visited antebellum mansions, and savored delicious southern cuisine. She felt free. One afternoon, as she sat in a charming courtyard, sipping sweet tea and listening to the sounds of the city, she pulled out her journal. She hadn't opened it for days. She had been too busy living her new life. She flipped through the pages, marveling at the progress she'd made. The old self who longed for her family's approval was fading away. In its place was a woman who was discovering her own path. On her final evening in Savannah, Evie had dinner at a small restaurant overlooking the Savannah River. As she watched the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, she realized that this trip had been more than just a vacation. It was a turning point. She'd spent too much of her life trying to earn her family's love. It was time to start loving herself. Back at home, her parents attempted to reach out with softer tones and carefully worded messages. "Hope you had a nice trip." One text from her mother read, "Maybe we can all talk soon." Evie stared at the message for a moment before putting her phone down. She wasn't ready to reply, and that was okay. This time, it would be on her own terms. A week after her return, she received a phone call from her mother. This time, she answered. "Hi, Evie." Her mother began, her tone unusually soft. "How was your trip?" "It was amazing." Evie replied, keeping her voice neutral. "That's good to hear." Her mother said, pausing as if searching for the right words. "We've been thinking a lot about what happened. Maybe we handled things poorly." Evie couldn't believe what they admitted. "Handled things poorly? You replaced me on a trip I set up and paid for, without even checking with me. Handled things poorly is an understatement." "I know," her mother said quietly. "Your dad and we didn't realize how much it would hurt you." "And Tiffany?" Evie asked. "Does she feel bad too? Or is she still blaming me for ruining her vacation?" "She's upset," her mother admitted. "But I think she knows she could have handled things better." Evie sighed. "Mom, this wasn't just about the trip. It's about years of putting her first and expecting me to pick up the slack. I'm not doing it anymore." "I understand," her mother said after a moment. "We're going to try to do better. We don't want to lose you." Her words tugged at Evie, but she'd learned not to let guilt dictate her choices. "I'm glad to hear that," she said. "But it's going to take more than words to fix this. I need to see real effort, not just apologies." "We will," her mother promised. "We'll give you the space you need, but I hope you'll let us back in someday." After the call, Evie felt a mix of relief and skepticism. It was clear that her parents were finally understanding the impact of their behavior, but would things truly change? Only time would tell. For the next few months, Evie kept her boundaries firmly in place. She responded to their calls and texts when she felt like it, but she did not go out of her way to fix things or to smooth over conflicts. Her focus was on creating a life that was full of joy and meaning and on finding a way to let go of the resentment that had become so familiar. She took a photography class, something she'd always dreamed of, and joined a local hiking group. She even started planning her next solo trip. One day, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, she felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She wasn't the person who bent over backwards for people who didn't appreciate her. She was someone who valued herself, who set boundaries, and who wasn't afraid to stand up for what she deserved. She was free. She was finally the author of her own story. The desert bloom was finally in full swing.